Okay, welcome. It's great to see everyone as our screens fill up with a number of rectangles of familiar faces and names, a number of new folks to the fold. Happy Wednesday to everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to get us started today. So welcome to Start Where You Are, Mapping a Journey Toward Equitable Data Practice. My name is Dan Ferris. I'm the Associate Director for Training and Education at the Social Policy Institute and a proud member of the Data Science for Social Impact team. DSSI, as we like to call it, is an amazing collaboration with local and national partners. Paul Sorensen from the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance is in the house. Welcome, Paul. Ginger Zielinskie and perhaps other data.org colleagues are here. And then, of course, this initiative is made possible with the generous support and partnership of MasterCard and the Center for Inclusive Growth. So as we're just getting warmed up, we know people are still streaming in, and that's fantastic for the first couple of minutes, as we're just doing a couple of top of the hour run of show, household and housekeeping. All of that said, this is unlikely your first time at the Zoom rodeo, but we're just so happy that you're here. So a couple of quick notes. So the DSSI is committed to meeting people where they are on their journeys, working in and around equity and community-centered data practice, strategy, and organizational culture. As one of the priorities and the visions and values of our initiative, we really are intent on increased knowledge and capacity, but then also connection around these critical topics. So you might notice today that we are very deliberately using Zoom meeting and not Zoom webinar. So folks are encouraged and welcomed to turn on their cameras, to be a part of their space as they're comfortable, utilize the chat, have cats meowing in the background. All of the things are very much welcomed as we are forming community around these critical topics. And just as a precursor, we will have a couple of discussions, both large group as well as breakouts. We know and appreciate, again, starting where you are, meeting you where you are, that if you're joining from us and just listening in, please feel free just to listen into breakouts if you're not able to come off mute or whatever it might be. And so they won't be particularly long, but just also wanting to make sure that people have a chance to connect with each other as we go. So all of that said, we always love to show and give a sense for who's in the room and have just a very quick opportunity for people to engage and share back with us. So from the registration information that people so kindly provided, we get to know a little bit about the folks who are registering for the event and here with us today. So in response to which best describes your role in relation to data, a pretty even split of folks who are here where working with data is your primary focus and data informing your work, but not your primary focus. And then a significant majority currently working in and with nonprofit or government, or as we like to shorthand, the social sector. And then again, a majority of folks from the St. Louis region, but then some really great interest coming in from folks around the country and then also beyond. And so with that in mind, we were actually going to do a very quick, I guess we could call it like a little bit of a warm up of sorts. Last time that we were all together, if you joined us for the kickoff, we had one of those amazing word clouds and how people identify. In the spirit of the theme of today's event, we are thinking about starting where you are as well as just where you are. So we'll put a link in the chat right now. And you can see it on my screen shared here. So right now, we're just have a map of the United States. You can, of course, zoom out if you're not located in the United States. You can zoom in if you want to kind of target in on a certain area. You do not need to give us your home address by any means with this activity. But if you look here, there is a pink add button, and you can pick the location to add it. So we'll give folks just a minute and see all of the great places where people are coming in from. A lot of Eastern Standard Time, just like you're joining us from the future. Some folks in California and Denver, Salt Lake, it looks like, or Northern Utah, welcome. Seattle. Shout out to Montana, which is on my hopeful and aspirational summer travel list for this year. A great clustering around St. Louis, the St. Louis region and area. And even around St. Louis, as we look out a little bit more into the West County, South City, the cluster around the city center itself. Okay, fantastic. Well, fantastic to see everyone on Zoom. Fantastic to use a little bit of a map engagement opportunity just to see where folks are joining in from today. And feel free as we continue on, if you're still figuring out the technology, to add a pin on here, and we'll look back at this later on in the program. So, not making any assumptions about where people are joining us from, of course. What we're really interested here in talking about today is data science for social impact. And what exactly is that? I'll be handing things over to my amazing colleague, Jen Rose Fitzgerald, to talk a little bit about this in just a minute. But before I hand things over, just to kind of give some centering. So as we find, most learning opportunities around data science are currently available that are more technically focused, geared toward aspiring data scientists, and not really reflective of the unique opportunities for the social sector. And so informing today's event and our offerings more broadly for the initiative are a series of roundtables last year that had participation from over 100 organizations, a speaker series, and engagement of the initiative with a wide range of colleagues and organizations doing work. I also want to just do a quick acknowledgement and sincere gratitude to our DSSI Advisory Committee, a number of members of whom are here with us today. Thank you for your great contributions. This advisory committee is critical in helping to set the values and vision of our initiatives, giving feedback along the way, and holding us accountable to the priorities that we've set along with our community partners. And last but not least, just wanting to acknowledge where this event today assessed where you are going, and why fits into a broader ecosystem of how we think about the core pillars or the foundations of data science for social impact. So with that, I'll hand things over to Jen Rose Fitzgerald, and we'll keep this event moving.
Thank you, Dan. As Dan mentioned, we knew when we started this initiative, we wanted to build capacity and connection around data in the social sector, but what would that look like? And these 6 focus areas were the result of many conversations with the advisory committee, stakeholders, partners, series of roundtables. And each month we were holding an event zeroing in on one of these focus areas. So today, that is assess where you are, where you're going, and why. And I also want to point out that with the guidance of our amazing advisory committee, we are committed to centering racial equity and community engagement across all of the focus areas, because these are the things that we need to grapple with at every stage when we're thinking about data and impact. So with that in mind, if we go to assess, the assess slide, this focus area is about assessing where you are, identifying where you want to go, and why. And so it's basically about taking inventory. What is your mission? What impact are you trying to have? Do you have the data needed to advance that mission? Do you have the people and the partners and the resources and a plan in place to make it happen? Does your staff have the skills they need to collect and analyze and manage data? Are data roles clearly defined? So these are kind of questions that you think about in terms of data capacity. When we talk about organizational capacity here, though, that means not only capacity in terms of working with data, but also capacity for thinking about equity and equitable outcomes and engaging with community. And these are areas where we know that social sector organizations have built a lot of muscles and have a lot of strengths as well. So this leads to questions like, who is most impacted by the data you collect and analyze and share? Does your organization have the skills and capacity to engage with clients or other community members in a way that builds mutual trust and benefit? Does your organization have a cohesive vision for integrating equity considerations across your data practices? So these are really big questions, and we don't have all the answers, but we have some tips and some tools to help you grapple with the big questions along the way. And our speakers today spend a lot of time thinking about these questions. So I will just jump right to them and let them jump in. We have our first speaker is Ginger Zielinskie, who is Chief Strategy Officer at data.org, where she does a lot of grappling with how to bring the power of data science to bear on the challenges that social sector organizations are working to address every day. And with over 20 years of experience, Ginger has a lot of knowledge in this area, and I should mention we have been fortunate to have her on our advisory committee as well. Before joining data.org, she served as president and CEO of Benefits Data Trust, where she led a successful scaling and strategy that helped more than 800,000 people access benefits that help them eat, heat their homes, and enroll in healthcare. Please join me in welcoming Ginger Zielinskie.
Hi there. Thank you so much for those kind words, and it's so nice to see all of your faces. Thank you so much for the invitation, Dan and Jen Rose. And I would just like to start the conversation in expressing gratitude for all of your time and effort and work in everything that you do. Social impact professionals are an extremely special bunch. And I just want to honor your grit and your determination and your hard work and late night dinners, often with a very different incentive structure than our friends in the private sector. So thank you for all of your work. And so I'm going to share some slides. So I'll probably toggle back and forth, assuming that my technology works. So just to start out, so I'm Ginger. I have the great privilege of being able to think about organizations, specifically social impact and not-for-profit organizations, and how do we strengthen their capacity to use data as a tool to achieve impact. There's a couple things that I want to kind of ground our conversation on. One, Start Where You Are is such an amazing title for this session, because wherever you are is where you need to be right now. And I think together we can continue to get better, and we'll continue to deliver on our missions and the outcomes we seek to achieve. And hopefully all of us will work ourselves out of a job. And that really, and I just want to hone in on data is a means to an end. Don't lose sight that it's one of many tools. And we all don't need to be using the most fancy, artificial intelligence out there, that there are tips and tools and applications that will meet you where you are, that will allow you to kind of incrementally get better. Secondly, I just love the conversation of like, where are you going and why? Because that will really, I think, ground how and what you want to do with data and what you want to achieve. And so I just wanted to call out both of those beautiful statements, I imagine, articulated by Jen Rose, because they seem like simple and you can just gloss right over them, but they in fact may be the two important statements of our conversation today. So before I jump in, why do I get to chat with you all today? So like Jen Rose said, I worked for 14 years. I ran a not-for-profit organization. I remember being like tilted on the line of credit. We had a $2 million line of credit. I was at like 1.8 million, and it was just like, holy crap, what are we going to do? So I say that because I understand the restrictions that you all operate under in terms of how do I continue to, if you're in health and human services, serve people better and as effectively as possible? How do I continue to innovate? How do I make all of these many funders happy because they want more metrics and they want more evidence? And how do I also then think about how do I get the right staff, understanding that some technology is very different culturally than maybe our health and human services stars? And how do we make those blends? So I wrestled with that for 14 years. I made pretty much every mistake in the book. And I was like, well, why is this so damn hard? And then had the great luxury of being able to step out of that role and think, how do we support organizations more holistically? These problems cannot be unique. And guess what? What we learned very quickly is that they aren't. So that really led data.org, who's a national or international field building organizations. We are extremely committed to building the field of data science for social impact. So where can we lay those building blocks, those pillars of continuity? How can we collect stories of amazing work that you all are doing within communities across the country? Are there shared tools, shared resources that we can learn from and exchange ideas as we seek to make this transformation? So that's a little bit about me and data.org, which then led us to building an open and free data maturity assessment. And so this was our attempt to again, help community-based organizations, NGOs, not-for-profits of all size, really ask, where are you today, right? How do we get a sense of like, well, I don't, do I need to run a security audit? Do I need, like, what do I need next? Do I need to hire a data scientist? Do I need to move my data to the cloud, right? Like, all of these questions are very reasonable questions. How secure is my data? All of those questions are really important questions. And the accessibility of information to help not-for-profit professionals answer them was pretty decentralized. So in addition to building a data maturity assessment, we also built a sister tool, a resource library. And when I'm not talking, I will share both of them in the chat, but I am afraid, oh, Jen Rose beat me to it. I was afraid to like click and do it because I had a little bit of technical difficulties, and I was like, if I click out here, Jen Rose is gonna kill me. But check out those resources, because part of our job in terms of where we are as a sector, as Jen Rose said, as it relates specifically to data and data science, we probably are a little bit behind. And that doesn't mean that we're not far ahead in other spaces and places. But as it relates to data, to the use of data and data science to achieve our mission, we've got some work to do. And our goal was to, in large part, make information about how to engage in this transformation or journey easier, and demystify it. Because a jargon can really take you crazy in terms of like, well, I'm not using natural language processing. What is NLP? How am I going to, and like, I'm here to tell you, it's just language that is very, you can grab your hands around it and understand what it means in a really kind of more accessible way, which is also part of making data science for social impact more equitable, is that we have to make it more accessible. We have to make that training more accessible, et cetera. So I'll get into that. As you can tell, I get a little amped up about this conversation. So if you have questions, please throw them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them as we go. And if you'd like to interrupt me, that's fine too. So now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you all see that? Jen Rose, can you give me a thumbs up if you see it? Awesome. Okay.
We can see all the slides on the side as well if you want to put it in slides.
Yep, there we go. So I'm going to focus my comments now on the data maturity assessment, but and I think also how do we embed equity and a conversation around equity within your data strategy and data maturity. So I'll focus on the data maturity assessment, but again, happy to answer any questions about resources, or really this is your time. So however I can be most helpful, would be happy to engage in those. There's just so many threads of this conversation that are interesting and important. So, as Jen Rose said, like there are a lot of us behind, right? We've got some work to do. I don't need to belabor this point. So the data maturity assessment, so what it was is we took a look at other maturity, there's one other point I want to make before I get in there. I spend a lot of time talking about not-for-profit organizations' data strategy. And one thing that we learned through those conversations is that it cannot be like on the side. It can't be like, well, here's my organizational strategies over here and my data strategies over here. And I would suggest to you that building an equitable data practice, or focusing or centering your work with an equity lens, also can't be on the side. It's not something that you can say, oh, here's our organizational strategy, and over here, we're going to have a nice little, employee resource group to talk about equity, or that actually these two important themes must be woven into how you lead, manage, and run your organization. And so as we talk, I think that the WashU team did a great job of building this panel in a way that we want to talk about data maturity, and we want to talk about building equitable organizations, and we need to do it in a way that's integrated. And so I may lean a little bit more towards data maturity, but well, I'll do my best to highlight and to call out how building equitable practices is essential to build an equitable data strategy, if that makes sense. I had the pleasure of chatting with Bridget a little bit prior to this conversation. And, you know, this message by the community for the community is the most important. And that as we think about building equity, whether it be our data strategy or organizational strategy or board strategy, name your strategy of the day, it is essential that we co-create alongside of communities or of members and people within the communities that we seek to empower and we seek to support. So all is to say, when we were building this data maturity assessment, we worked lockstep with community-based organizations and not-for-profits across the globe to make sure that we were articulating the questions and building the scope in the right way. I'll skip this. So for those of you that have taken the data maturity assessment before, this will be a little bit of a spin through. So we think about data maturity again as a journey and as a continuum. You never actually really arrive, I'm afraid to say, that it always is, how can we better use data in service to meet our mission? And so when we think about the three kind of big buckets of work, you can think about how you use data for purpose, right? How are you using data to set your strategy? How are you using data to inform your programs and inform your operations? So think about everything related to how you're building your organizational strategy, and are you using SMART goals? Do you have ways to map your theory of change that are data driven? I had the great luxury of engaging, and a lot of you were able to join us in conversations across the country through a project called Recode. And it was all about building equity-centered community data ecosystems. So how do community-based organizations share data with each other around, in order and in service to the community and shared goals? And what we heard loud and clear is this concept of how to use data to articulate shared purpose is extremely hard and extremely essential. So as we think about purpose, if you are sharing data with others, or you want to strive towards being equity-centered and equity-focused, who are you including in the conversations about what you should prioritize and how it should be measured? And so that is one section of the data maturity assessment, is really honing in on purpose. And within the concept of the conversation today about using data with an equity-centered focus, how you're articulating shared goals and measuring them is paramount. This is true for foundations as well. This isn't just the burden is not just on our community-based organizations, but I also would really encourage our foundations to ask who is around the table when they're articulating strategies for a community or strategies for a portfolio. And how are we making sure that those conversations are centered around co-creation and inclusivity? Jen Rose, you give me the hook if I'm talking too far and too long. You can just say, you got 2 minutes, Ginger, wrap it up. In addition, so if purpose is the first tranche, the second tranche that we really built the data maturity assessment to assess was practice. And I hear that advertisement, we're talking about practice, but so practice is really about like the tools and the processes, right? Like do you have the right policy and procedures in place? Are you following the right regulations? You know, it's very interesting, I think, that the not-for-profit sector, for many of us who maybe have worked at a homeless shelter or a food pantry or a food bank or a women's shelter, or a workforce support program. We collect very sensitive and intimate information. And there's great responsibility in that. And that it needs to be protected. So how we think about data security also falls under practice, and data quality. So this gets into like how it's collected, stored, analyzed. So that's the second tranche of work that the data maturity assessment really seeks to better understand and provide recommendations about how to improve. As it relates to this conversation about building equitable data practices, this is extremely important, because how those policies and procedures are created and then adhered to really will articulate a stance about how your organization works with an equitable lens. So to that end, I'm gonna pause for a brief second and ask Dan to pull up. We've got two quick polls, so don't worry, these are not complicated algebra, but just wanted to really kind of get a quick sense from you. So Dan, if you would be so kind as to pull them up. The first poll question, under our practice, and this is really just to get a sense of where you guys think you are, is, and this is for your organization. And this is kind of just a good, you guys know what you're doing. This is a well-practiced bunch. I'm actually really curious to see what the answer to this is. So we conduct a benefits and risks and harms assessment of the data we collect. I think we're going to have a good old bell curve. Everything goes back to the bell curve. I'm sorry, it does.
Yeah, we're just at about 3/4 participation. We'll give folks just another minute to click one of the three options, and then we'll show the results and have a little bit of discussion.
Thank you, Dan. So we can probably, can everyone see this, Dan, or is it just me that can see it? Everyone can see it. Okay, so we've got about half of folks saying we do not conduct any type of assessment about both the benefits and risks. I would suggest to you this might be a very good exercise. And another 25% saying I don't know, and 24, great job, you are. But in the spirit of this conversation, why this matters is that you want to be able to engage in this type of ongoing assessment in order to be able to tease out unintended consequences. And that not that you're acting with malintent or that there's malicious actors involved, but to be able to collect, analyze, and potentially share extremely vulnerable data. It is important that we go in eyes wide open and with a very strong position around equity.
And Ginger, I just want to point out in the chat, someone said this was hard to answer because our team does this very informally or ad hoc, which I imagine is true for a lot of people.
Yes. So first off, celebrate the progress you've made. You are having the conversation. Then, as we think about our organizations and our institutional memory and how we build an equity-centered organization, it's really important that we also codify it. So that's where you are, and that's wonderful. And so then the next step is like, okay, how do we really embed this into the fabric of how we work and how we work with data? Dan, would you be so kind as to pull up the next poll? Thank you. Okay, so this is more on the policy and practice section. We regularly monitor, update, and improve our data ethics policies and practice. And I will say, you will hear a groan from me when we start talking about policies and practices. I will confess to you all. But this is really important as we think about strengthening the data maturity of organizations. So moving from that ad hoc position to a more formal and professional, really professionalizing our data strategy is an important step as we think about our data maturity. So a little bit of a different curve here. So we have more yeses here. So our policies and practices seem to be in a little bit better shape than maybe some of our risk analysis. So that's actually really, really great in terms of then it allows us to then think, how do we embody them and how do we put them to action? We can stop this poll. That was super helpful. Thank you. And I think that the way that we start to live our data ethics policies about how we'll share data, what we will collect, for what purposes, how long do we hold it, who has access to it, think about your permissions across the data lifecycle. So from collection to storage, from analysis, and then iteration, who is able to access that information, especially within community-based organizations, are all really important considerations to discuss. But in order to have those ethics, those policies and practices in action, and in order to act on those assessments that are conducted, I think that, you know, one of the most important components within assessing your data maturity is assessing your people. Let's see, I'm having a hard time moving my screen. I'm going to stop share. Sorry about that. My technical difficulties are haunting me today. So we're just going to talk about people really quickly. So think about all of the humans. And I had one of my first directors of data science. He said to me, and he probably hates that I repeat this, he was like, you know, the thing about this project, and we were working on a really complicated data project, and he's like, the pesky humans. And so I say that as you know, as a joke, but it's like the culture and the leadership and the team and the partnerships and the agreements is the hardest part, right? So Renee agrees, right? The collecting the data is easy, but how we decide how to use it, how we set a framework for how our team will interact with it. How do we embed and create a culture where technologists who are technology first meet with our subject matter experts to create the magic of what is data science for social impact? That's the hardest part. So in our data maturity assessment, we really worked to understand what is the culture of the organization. And I would go back to where I started in terms of thinking about, okay, we've got our data maturity, and then we've got trying to be as equitable as possible. And that really then, that braid comes to life in the culture of the organization that we seek to curate. And we've got to be deliberate about it. And again, I think that that's what then allows all of the other hard work to flow. And that's the organizational change that is, you know, incumbent upon all of us as social impact leaders. Like, in order to do this the right way, we have to be equity centered. We have to be equity led. And in order to meet the scale of the problems in front of us, it's incumbent upon us to use data as effectively as possible. But we do carry more responsibility in terms of co-creation and inclusivity and demonstrating how to do this well. And I am certain that you all are making great strides in your ability to do so. So I encourage you to, if you have questions like, what the hell is she talking about? You know, a risk and benefits assessment, check out that resource library. Our goal was, again, to make this as accessible as possible. If you're wondering where your organization is, I would encourage you to take a look at that data maturity assessment. And the third thing I'll share in the chat when I'm done is we just finished this report with our friends at Health Leads and Data Across Sectors for Health called Recode, and I'll make sure to share that if you're trying to really think about how to build community data ecosystems that are equity centered. So I'll pause there. Happy to take questions. Also happy to kick it off and learn from the other participants.
Really quickly, Ginger, thank you so much. Could you just tell people when they take this assessment, what comes to them in the form
Yeah,
of?
absolutely. Absolutely. So the assessment should take you around 10 minutes. And when you're running through that assessment, it's pretty easy to use. We worked on language to make sure that it was extremely accessible. And then what happens is you get this 3-part score that then provides you with a cumulative score. And from that 3-part score, we then match you with specific guides or resources that are available on the data.org website. And you also get a PDF that provides this assessment. Now, I should say to like the data folks that are working in the organization, trying to move that big boulder up the hill, like, we've got to invest more. We need to do this. We need to do that. We need another analyst. We need a better infrastructure. We need better security. We need a security audit. Our goal was to create a communications document that you can then take to your executive leadership, to your board, to your colleagues. So the goal is like, let this also become a objective assessment that helps persuade others about how we think about investment in our organizations on a march to being more data-driven.
Thank you so much, Ginger. And I know that we have our colleagues from Operation Food Search in a little while later on in this event are going to talk about how they're using this assessment in their work. So I think that's a great point. So before we go on to the next speaker, which I'm really excited, is there any last questions for Ginger about the data maturity assessment? I do see something in the chat that says, I'm curious about conversations about
Classic Wi-Fi freeze mid-sentence. I think General was just segueing into Jonesy's great question and point, which Ginger, if you'd like to touch upon, or Bridget, if this is coming up in your piece as well. I know Trina and Carlton as well from an organizational lens can touch upon this in terms of thinking about equitable practice in terms of responsibility for entering data in terms of who's responsible for those tasks as well. So as we're thinking about structures from an organizational standpoint, not only like how groups are talking about adherence to ethics and thinking about harm and risk, but thinking about how I won't call it the burden, but there we go, the responsibility for data entry and otherwise are kind of kept at an organizational lens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I map it in a lot of ways to the data lifecycle, Dan, in terms of, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity to think about training and supports for our folks who are on the ground collecting data. And as we think about transparency, and as we think about both policy and practice, one of the most impactful steps that we took when I was CEO of Benefits Data Trust is that we asked questions about our data and then realized that we had not communicated or trained effectively. So we went through an organization-wide training where we talked about, this is the data we collect, this is how it's used, and this is why. And that information sharing alone, I think really made great steps towards being more equitable in terms of, because then it opened up, we had 100 folks doing data entry on the phone, but it allowed them to think more critically and creatively about how this data can and should be used in service to the people that they were speaking with on the telephone. So that level of transparency and ongoing training, I think, is a really important component. I'm not sure if she's talking about from a physical perspective, actual like hands. I probably have a little bit less.
Yeah, no, Ginger, you got like you're on the right track kind of head nod from Jonesy. So happy to come back to this as well, as we've got plenty of time at the end of the event, just to go a little deeper into some of the questions folks have. With that, it's actually my pleasure both to address a question that came up in the chat and segue us to our next amazing speaker. So if folks wanted to offer a humble round of applause, emoji or otherwise, if you're on camera, for Ginger, with immense thanks for sharing your incredible experience and expertise and passion for this area of data science for social impact, and specifically for the social sector. Really appreciated, Ginger. So as there's a little bit of drilling going on in my background, and Jennifer had a little tech hiccup, but it looks like she's back on her phone. So I'm happy just to take our next handoff regardless. Oh, we've got emojis lighting up my chat and everything. This is great. Latifa, thank you so much for your question. If you are so excited about the data maturity assessment that you'd like to pull it up in the background using the link and start taking a peek, working through it, please feel free, but it is not a prerequisite for completing the rest of the meeting. And it'd also be remiss to encourage anyone to do anything but turn your full attention to our next amazing speaker, Bridget Blount. So Bridget joined the Baltimore's Promise team in 2018 and serves as the Chief Impact Officer. She's passionate about helping nonprofit organizations harness the power of data to strengthen their organizations, improve services, and communicate impact. So Bridget also currently serves as the president of the Baltimore Area Evaluators. So speaking of applause, if you'd please join me in giving a round of an enthusiastic round of virtual Zoom applause for Bridget. I'll turn things over to you now as our next speaker. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Good afternoon. Really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you all today around data and how we center and examples of ways we can center equity in our data planning. So I'll pull up my slides. Perfect. So today I have the great opportunity to discuss how do we center equity and community in our development of our data strategy and our planning. One of the, excuse me. So I want to share a little bit about myself. As Dan mentioned, I am currently the Chief Impact Officer with an organization called Baltimore's Promise. Baltimore's Promise is a collective impact organization, a part of the National Strive Together Network. So we are a nonprofit that provides more systemic support to leverage public, private, and system partners in order to achieve outcomes for young people, to improve outcomes for young people across the cradle to career continuum. So I believe myself more of a practitioner slash data person, if we're talking about the work. I have researchers on my team, and we are like, I'm like, man, I consider myself a practitioner when it comes to this work. I'm a Baltimore native. I have worked with more like hundreds of nonprofits, specifically small nonprofits here in Baltimore, to think through what does it mean to collect data? Why are we collecting the data? To really understand results-based accountability frameworks and performance metrics. And so thinking through theory of change, logic models, and then ultimately, and I've been literally the only data person on the team to now leading a team of about 8 different data analysts and directors. And so I am excited to come to you all to talk about my experiences working in the nonprofit data sector, but also most recently, I've been working with an organization called Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. And AISP recently as in 2 years ago, it feels like it was recent because it was during a pandemic, we released a toolkit centering equity throughout the data life cycle. And this was an opportunity to really think through, in the process of data use, what are the considerations and how do we actually apply equitable practices in our work? And so I'm excited to be able to talk to you all today. A little bit about how the process to design the toolkit, and then some practices that we currently use in our organization through Equitable in our practices of planning and equity. So the Centering Racial Equity Toolkit, again, we started this work maybe about 4 years ago now. It was quite a while ago, right here in Baltimore, Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. And this was an effort to really think through. At the time, there wasn't a lot of material out, there wasn't a lot of resources for practitioners who were really interested in thinking through if I wanted to develop a integrated data system, or if any data sharing collaborative efforts, what does it mean to be equitable in this process? And so we set with a work group that included both nonprofit funders, it included government agencies, as well as community equity advocates. And so we sat there and we really thought through, well, if we're thinking about the data lifecycle, what are these questions that we should be asking ourselves? And so the toolkit is really, I really enjoy the toolkit because oftentimes when you get some, resources, it's really theoretical, and that's great. But as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm a practical, like I want to know, like, what do you mean by this? How can I actually apply this? And so the toolkit provides that theoretical as well. So talks and, offers, okay, if in your planning throughout the data lifecycle, what does it look like for us to apply equity? But it also offers work in action stories. And so then they have small case studies that will really kind of help you dive deep if you read through the resource, and to understanding how other people across the country are really thinking through and working through embedding equity in their data use projects. And so one of the things that, one of the quotes that's in the resource is, as railroads and highways both are developed in decimated communities, so too can data infrastructure. And this is really important as we're thinking about our data, because it's important that we're thinking about keeping the end in mind when we're doing this work. And so we can either use data as a tool to help identify and to promote equity, or data can be used to actually exacerbate and further harm communities that are vulnerable communities. And so it depends on us being intentional around the ways that we're using data, by which the data will actually be helpful or exacerbate further harm. So where do we need to connect to center data? I think we're all clear that we should be centering data throughout the entire life cycle. If we're looking at entire data lifecycle, and we're looking at the 6 stages of the data lifecycle, is from planning all the way through reporting and dissemination. In the toolkit, it has this great visual where you're able to say, okay, what are some positive practices of planning, and then what are some problematic practices? And I was like, this is great. I want to actually see how are we doing this or using this in our organization. And so that's what I'll talk about today, examples of how we're using this and how we have thought about equity in our data work at Baltimore's Promise. So quick kind of summary of the conversation that we're about to have. Some key considerations in equity and data planning. It's important that we identify our key stakeholders, that we're building community relationships and trust, that we're co-creating an agenda setting, that we're working to shift power in decision-making, and that we're building capacity and accessibility. And so what does that mean? We'll walk through that today, and please feel free to, share questions in our chat, and I'll be happy to answer. So the first thing is, who should be at the table? When we're thinking about planning for our data strategy, I think to Ginger's point earlier, planning is actually thinking about the entire project from start to end, right? And actually starting with the end in mind, like, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the purpose? How are we answering these questions? And so what we want to first think about, is who should be at the table when we're making these decisions. Oftentimes, as data professionals, we don't have the opportunity to actually engage community members. Where our stakeholders might be the program staff members, but it might not be necessarily directly our community members. And so the toolkit offers a matrix to really help you think through mapping your stakeholders, 1, and then 2, identifying who's critical to the conversation, who's important to the conversation, and who do you need to keep informed. And so it's important that as we're thinking through, all right, so I'm thinking through, we're starting a data project. I want to think through, okay, what kind of questions I want to ask. I want to think through the timeline. I want to think through, why this information is important. Then who should I involve? And really, you should attempt to include as many diverse perspectives that are connected to the issue as possible. So if we're looking at, want to know about youth opportunity, that's one of our big projects that we're working on currently, is to understand youth who are not connected to school or work. The best way to understand youth who are not connected to school or work is to talk to youth who are not connected to school or work. It's not actually we can easily look at the data. We can say, oh, their, maybe their reading scores or academic scores or whatever they may be. They need support in transportation. We can look at the qualitative data on paper, but it's important that we're having conversations with the people who are actually experiencing the issues that we are attempting to analyze in order to really come up with a plan for how we're going to address it, whether or not it's our data analysis plan or our plan for support. Next, it's important that we're building community relationships and trust. The way we do this is by listening, right? So this is not us coming in and saying, hey, we have this great idea. What do you all think? This is us actually being in community with, in community with our stakeholders, our client populations, young people, families, whatever they may be, consistently, regularly. This isn't when we have something going to them. It's actually convening and attending community meetings to listen to the needs and issues that are identified by the members of the community. And so this is one of the questions I oftentimes get. So we have a community advisory board on our at our organization, and people oftentimes ask us how do you all how do you all continue the engagement of the community advisory board, right? Like when you have questions, do you just go and get other people? And really, because we're doing consistent engagement throughout the entire process, it's not that we have to go find anyone to do our work, right? It might be we need additional expertise because of the issue that we're looking at, but we have a core group of community advisors by which we're always in communication with to help us determine one, program direction, as well as the direction for our data projects. So that's one, convening and attending community meetings. I think it's important to acknowledge past harms as well that's caused by government researchers, philanthropic foundations, and our own agencies. Data has harmed communities of color, communities that are low-income communities. Data has harmed people who have, unfortunately, that are vulnerable communities, right? So are at social disadvantages. And so that harm has oftentimes occurred because those communities have not been a part of the interpretation and collection of that data. And so it is important that, so when a lot of researchers come into town, so in Baltimore, we are a huge research city. We have Johns Hopkins here, University of Maryland. We have enough colleges and universities for the whole country, probably right here in Baltimore. And so what has oftentimes happened is that a lot of times our researchers will come into communities, they will do amazing, and I won't say that the 2 years that they're there, that the work that they did was not amazing. But then once those 2 years are gone, the funding is gone, then that program is gone. And so we did not build any sustainability within that community so that once that funding and the grant was gone, then the program also was left. And so oftentimes we're leaving communities in spaces that are less advantageous as when we found them. It's important that we're being transparent about our goals for the data effort. So when we're thinking about planning, sometimes I think people, I feel like I've been in this space as well, where you're worried that by saying, oh, we want to collect this sensitive information, people will actually say, no, I don't want to give it. I would prefer not to have it. And that is their right to be able to say, hey, what is the goal of this data effort? How will this be able to use and allow individuals to opt out of being included, their data being included in a project? But what you'll actually find is that when you're transparent and you're actually able to clearly articulate that this information is to inform our program services and ultimately to improve outcomes and conditions of well-being for young people, community members are extremely ready to be able to be a part of that project and that process. And then allocating appropriate time and resources. This is key. Here is one, we do offer stipends to our community members. So our young people, our practitioners that sit on as experts on our collaboratives. So we do offer stipends, but also the time I think is important. This is a time-intensive process when you're talking about community engagement. This is not something that you're going to do as part of your regular data lifecycle and say, I'll be done in a month, right? This is going to be 3 months once you're adding community engagement into it. And so just being prepared and setting realistic expectations is important. So then this next co-creation of the agenda. This is important in thinking about, okay, how do we collaborate with both program staff and individuals to identify what's actually contributing to outcomes. I think I talked about this a little bit in a previous slide, but hosting design sessions so that we can develop balanced agendas, determine our strategic direction, and then also conducting community needs assessments and mapping community assets. It's really important that we're taking this from a strength-based approach, and that we're not just trying to figure out what are the needs, but what are the assets that are already built into the community that will actually be able to help us as we're designing solutions. Because again, we're starting with the end in mind. So we want to understand directly from young people, families, communities, individuals with lived experiences, what do they believe are the root causes of whatever it is that we're trying to analyze. And then we want to talk to as many people as possible. So whether or not that's through data gallery walks, or if that's through a smaller project with community participatory research. Shifting power in decision making. So this is thinking through how are decisions made and who has authority to make those decisions when we're designing data projects or just designing projects in general. And so there's this continuum of community participation that I'm sure many of you have probably seen before, from not involved all the way to empowered. And so there are a lot, as I mentioned before, data projects that are done without any involvement of community stakeholders. And at best, the outcome from the data projects, so the report might be accessible publicly, but that's about it when it comes to involvement for community stakeholders. But then you have the range, which is oftentimes, I think people are falling towards this informing and actively engaging, whereas providing, where most of us are going to we've identified an issue that we would like to address. We're going to community, we're saying, hey, we have this issue, you all have this issue, and we're trying to better understand it. And then we have determined this is our data project, this is our plan, and this is how we're going to move forward with it. Or it's, okay, well, can you all give us feedback on that plan? Excuse me. And what we're hoping to move towards is more towards this collaborating and empowering. And so this will allow us to ensure that community members are a part of the process the entire way, and that we're shifting the decision-making to community members relating to who we're serving and what funding allocations we should be making. Excuse me. So shifting power, how can we do this? We can do this by including community members that are impacted on the decision of which vendors and consultants we select. So if we're thinking about evaluation committee members, if we're thinking about evaluation consultant, if we're thinking about someone to coordinate projects or whatever our vendors may be, we can create review committees that include both technical experts as well as experts from the community. So one of the ways that we do it is that on each of our review committees, we include a young person, if it is related to a young person issue, or we include a practitioner, and or it could be both, and or we include practitioners who will actually be a part of the process. And so making sure that we're including people who actually will benefit from the work as part of the work that we're hoping that will benefit, and the selection of consultants is important. Also, data governance structures. So included in the management and oversight of the work, it's important that we include young people and families. One example of the way that we do this here at Baltimore's Promise is we just launched this youth and young adult grant making activity, and this youth and young adult grant making project enables youth and young adults from 16 to 24 to make decisions on who receives grants. So they will be dispersing $250,000 in grant making, the youth and young adults will. And so even prior to this effort, the management team that thought about this process included 2 youth members. So the management team to determine the youth and young adult strategy included 2 young adults between the ages of 18 and 24. It included some BP project team and some external partners, right? And so it is ensuring that our governance structures are at a place that will facilitate effective inclusion of youth, families, and community members. Another way is collaborative decision-making processes. So we talk about one, including communities in deciding on vendors, talk about oversight and management. Another way is the shifting of the power balance, because well, oftentimes we might think about one-to-one, right? So one community member and one staff member, so that's equal decision-making ability. But what we don't often think about, or what we could shift to think about to be more equitable to ensure we're meeting community needs, is shifting the power balance so that you can have more community representation than agency and funding staff. An example of us doing this here at Baltimore's Promise is our Be More Invested initiative, where we were dispersing funding and of $150,000 to 10 grantees. And so what we did was we created a grant advisory team to make the determination on which grantees we should fund. The grant advisory team was comprised of 23 community advisors and 10 funders. And so that is like a completely different kind of shift in philanthropy and thinking through, oh, wait, so the funders did not have the power balance to actually kind of determine which grantees were funded. We wanted to make sure that those community members, those community leaders who we had identified were the ones who were able to appropriately kind of vote and have authority on which grantees we were choosing. And then secondly, giving community members sole decision-making authority to determine new projects and funding allocations. So this is, as I mentioned before, our youth, young adult grant making. Young people are literally making the decision on who we will select as grantees. They will do the oversight. We're paying them to do this entire process for the next year. And we are also including in there building capacity, which I think is our next one. So we're also building capacity in the work that we're doing as well. So how are we building capacity? So data gallery walks, I think most of us are aware of those, but it's also important that we're investing in research and evaluation training for our community members. We want them to be, this is a part of the timing thing, right? So we want our community members to be able to show up and to be able to accurately engage in the material. And so in order to do that, it's important that we are thinking through what is culturally relevant material that we can provide so that they have the skills, knowledge in order to be able to share their input. Important also is hiring data and technology staff with lived experiences. I don't think we do this enough, right? and let me just be clear, like so many of our data and tech people do not look like the community by which they're doing the data and technology analysis and interpretation and dissemination work. Which is, I mean, you know, as long as we're investing in some training and things of that sort, that could work. But we also can do it the opposite. We can actually hire people with lived experiences to facilitate data projects as well. And I think that you will find it's actually even more fruitful to hire from people with lived experiences, whether or not that's the community or the practitioners, right? Because our staff have expertise as well. And so building up capacity internally and or from community members who have been a part of our conversations will actually just have a ripple effect on increasing equity in our work. Meeting the needs of community members to help to be able, so that they can be able to show up. So that's hosting meetings outside of traditional working hours, providing incentives, hosting meetings at central locations. Some people don't think about the fact that our organizations are located in predominantly white neighborhoods that might not necessarily be in off the transportation line. So so it's like, all right, so we're gonna have it in our organization, but how am I supposed to get there? So thinking about where you're hosting. So if you can host it at a school, if you can host it at a community center. So thinking about these data walks or your data activities or hosting things, thinking about accessibility is extremely important when we're planning our work. And then this is key. So I also always get this question around, well, how do we get the funders to, be willing to shift this type of power? And oftentimes I was like, well, our funders, we've just been working with them. But if I wanted to codify how we got here, one, it has taken 5 years that our executive director has been in place to get us to a place where we were able to have a community advisory board. But the reason why is because we invested intentionally in education of the funders to be able to kind of identify power dynamics, right? So it is important that we're investing in equity and training for the funders, for the program staff, for executive leadership, also to unpack their biases. And so when young people are showing up in spaces, they're not necessarily being squashed or put down or not being able to equally share their feedback. And so it's important that we are kind of approaching it both ways. We're investing in research and evaluation training for our community members, but we're also investing in bias training for our funders and stake and staff members. Okay, do we have time? So we're going to stop and do a break. Perfect. So now we're going to do breakout sessions, and hopefully that wasn't too quick. I talked relatively fast. We're going to do small breakout sessions. And so in the breakout sessions, I would love for us, it's going to be a quick 5 minutes. I know some of them are sometimes like not fun, but what is your organization doing to build trust? And so answering that question, or what aspects of your data processes are open to decision-making from community stakeholders? So picking one. So what are you doing to build trust, or in what ways have you shifted power to allow decision-making from community members?
Absolutely. And just as a friendly reminder, so we have this set up recognizing that folks are in all different kinds of circumstances. Some people are staying on mute, some people are driving. So the rooms will be big enough that, if you can't come off mute, please do stick around. We've got some great content coming up after the breakouts as well. And then, of course, if you're able to connect with a few colleagues, you're very much welcome. So we'll open up these breakout rooms right now, and then we'll bring people back together in just a few minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Based on folks' facial expressions when they were coming back in, the conversation was robust, and I wanted to avoid the dreaded 60-second countdown. So sorry if it was a little bit abrupt or jarring for folks, but we'll turn things right back over to Bridget, just if there's a brief moment of reflection and connection across the larger group, and then we'll get moving fast. And absolutely, Allie, lightning round goes fast. We were keeping an eye on the clock and couldn't believe how quickly it was going.
Wow, I must say, I know there was some concern about the breakout session, but that was really really robust. And so I appreciate the conversation and thoughtfulness from the breakout session that I was in. So would love to hear, let's group chat. What are one or two, if somebody wants to come off mute and share in the chat, what is one thing this conversation has raised for you, or that your group really kind of talked about in your breakout sessions? I think I saw one coming up in the chat. Anyone want to share anything that this conversation around trust, around decision-making, kind of prompted you to think about? Okay. I'm not a teacher and I don't like the pause.
Here's one in the chat.
Okay.
That community engagement in the data collection or use process is ongoing, and there's not one model that will work. And another person says we use this resource when planning our community data sessions.
Awesome. It's definitely iterative, Kate, and requires a lot of attention in this process. Thank you. All right. So I'll move us along. Doing a quick recap, it's important that we are identifying what key stakeholders should be at the table. So that is being intentional about being inclusive of our client populations, our partners in the work, as well as any existing agency systems that might also be responsible for supporting our client population. So it's important in identifying them. You can do that in our stakeholder mapping. That's exercise that is offered in the toolkit. It's important now in building community relationships and trust. A lot of the trust between agencies and community members need a lot of repair. And so that repair will take a humbleness on the side of the agency to show up and to continue to show up in these places, even when community members are saying you have failed, right? And so the conversation then shifts to how can we then get this right? It's co-creating and agenda setting. So it's developing the agenda, the plan, thinking through why we're doing this work in collaboration with community. It's shifting power and decision making. It is determining who will make the decision on what is funded, who will make the decision on what questions are asked, and who will make the decision on why we are doing this work. And then it's building capacity on both the work of the agencies, the nonprofit staff members, as well as the community members who are engaging collectively in this effort. And that is all that I have today. I think we're about to transition, and as questions come, I'll be here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That was amazing. And it sounds like everybody had a good experience in the breakouts. And I think we will have a robust conversation coming out of this at the end of the event based on what I'm seeing in the chat. So glad to bring up some of the questions people are posing again when we get to the end here. We do have one more set of speakers. So I just want to say it's great to hear you talk about the fact that when you're thinking about equity and community that you never fully arrive, and that this is true with data capacity and with equity as well. And when it comes to thinking about equity and community engagement, and then thinking about data and us being really interested in the intersection where those things come together, Bridget, you really seem to live at the intersection of those two places, and I really appreciate that. So now we have two people from Operation Food Search who have been grappling sort of across the spectrum, thinking about their data strategy, thinking about these questions of community and equity, and they are going to share how they are using some of these same tools in the process of grappling. We love the term grappling because none of us have it totally figured out. So Operation Food Search was founded in 1981. It's a hunger relief organization that provides free food and nutrition education and innovative programs proven to reduce food insecurity. Their vision is that all children and families have the nutrition, food, and skills they need to live a healthy life. So today we have Carlton Adams, Chief Operations Officer, and Trina Reagan, Chief Innovation Officer, to talk a little bit about how they've been mapping their data journey as an organization and things they are grappling with along the way. So take it away.
All right, thank you. So I'm Carlton, and just by way of introduction, my role as Chief Operating Officer is I support several areas, as you can imagine, which include human resources and diversity, equity, inclusion, our nutrition, education, and community nutrition programs, all of our warehouse operations and procurement, our Metro Market, which is a mobile grocery store. And what did I forget? It'll come to me. Let me move it to my colleague real quickly, Trina.
Thanks, Carlton. Hi, everyone. My name is Trina Reagan. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at OFS. And essentially, 5 years ago, OFS created a new pillar of work called Champion Change. And the idea was to build on the legacy programs, many of which Carlton just covered, that fall under his purview, by looking for new ways to address nutritional security. So how can we work upstream so that fewer people are in need of the emergency food safety net? And so I was essentially brought on to create a new way of thinking about things. And so the programs that fall under my My departments are policy and advocacy work, which we primarily work at the state level on a lot of policy issues, a little bit on the federal level. And then also we have a pretty robust portfolio of food as medicine programming right now, and some other innovative pilots where we're looking at where nutritional security intersects with things like education and early childhood. And so between the two of us, we cover every program or dimension of work at Operation Food Search.
Yeah, a little bit of clarification as well. When we say food rescue organization, that our legacy as an organization is in food banking. So we're an independent food bank. So if those of you in St. Louis that know that, apologize for going over that again, but that it's a significant part of what we do here. But as Trina described, that's not all that we do. And I think there, as we discuss how we interface with data and how we think about data, and more specifically and more importantly, how we think about those things with respect to equity, I think it's important for us to think about food banking just for a second. So food banking in the large ways that it's done in the United States is about a half a century old now. So Jen Rose mentioned that we were founded in 1981, and this work has been ongoing since that time. But to reach the folks that food banking doesn't reach, we have to think about how we can interface with food justice as a movement differently than we do today, and that does take data. And it's just I think to set the table appropriately, it is not accurate for us to say that we have a data policy. Now I didn't spend any time, thankfully, kind of wrestling with a way to suggest that we had a data strategy. And I said policy, but I mean strategy. That trying to make up something data strategy like that we don't have a data strategy. We collect some data, and I would say that our approach to data collection is situational. So we collect data with respect to the agencies or food pantries, 200 of them in the St. Louis metro area that we work with. So we get demographic data about the neighbors that they're serving. We collect data from our summer meals program, from our Operation Backpack program that sends food home with kids during the school year. We have more sophisticated, which I think Trina will talk a little bit about in our food as medicine programming, more sophisticated data collection there because we're actually working with specific neighbors that have specific problems that may be informed by and improved by better nutrition. But for the most part, we collect data based on the programming that we're doing, a lot of which is legacy programming. So we don't have a sophisticated approach that is collecting data, sharing it across the multiple departments of our organization, synthesizing that then into programming that we consequently launch. To me, that is a type of data strategy that we would aspire to, but we're not quite there yet. Okay.
Oh, sorry, Carlton. I was just going to say this came at the perfect time for us when Jen Rose suggested this, and I was so excited when Ginger introduced the idea of a data maturity assessment, as well as learning about the AISP toolkit, because we just completed a strategic plan, and one of the priorities for our organization is really looking at how we can have that overall comprehensive strategic data plan or data strategy for our organization. I was just talking to Carlton earlier this morning, and I told him, I said, I feel very much like we're looking for our data maestro. I feel like if you think about the different departments of our organization, and a policy is the woodwinds, and maybe our pantries are the percussion. Like, we have data that we're collecting. They're all playing their own tune. They're collecting data that they use for very specific reasons, but we don't have any way right now of bringing all that data together in a way to kind of create a more comprehensive sound. And so I think in being able to dive deeply into these two tools, it gave us some ideas of where we could go next in terms of steps. And so I know Carlton is going to speak a little bit to the AISP toolkit, which we loved, Bridget, and then I'll talk a little bit to the data maturity assessment.
Thank you. So one more thing, I think with respect to data that we collect, because we have been, in food banking for a long time, you think about food bank provides food to pantries, and that's where people interface to actually get food that they take home. There's a lot of spaces that we don't touch, but the response of food banking over the last, again, half century has been to push more food through that supply chain, since that's a popular term these days. But I would argue that that doesn't feed one additional person, because if you can't access the food where it is now, more food being there doesn't really solve anything for us. It also doesn't get to systemic issues, as you all know, that cause hunger and ultimately poverty in the first place, right? So what are we going to do to think about that differently? One of the things, as we talk about or refer to the toolkit, which is Bridget, quite amazing. One of the things that was really intriguing to me was when looking at the mapping assets and engaging community. Trina mentioned that we just went through a process of updating our strategic plan, and one of the things that we're trying to center there is strategic partnerships. And so how do we forge partnerships that get us to be involved in appropriate ways in food justice movement work in this area, where we can be of support. So I kind of liken it to a passenger vehicle. In some initiatives, you may want to be in the driver's seat. In other initiatives, you may want to be in the front passenger seat, but there are many more where you will be in a rear passenger seat, right? So areas that we may be striking partnerships that can help service more people in our community, but they're not things that we do within Operation Food Search. But then how do we pick those initiatives? How do we forge those partnerships? How are we finding ways to really significantly state what our purpose is and how we can help that work? And a big part of that is really collecting the proper kind of data to understand the work that's being done and how that's solving problems in the community. The other thing about food banking, again, it's just my side of the house as we're representing it, is that we've been measuring, again, for that same half a century, output. So again, put more food into the system, get more food from donors, or get more dollars to buy more food, again, from the commercial food system. So that all sounds good. But quite frankly, it sounds good, it's measurable, and it's digestible to donors. So that's okay for donors, but generally speaking, donors are not the food insecure, right? So how are we measuring impact? If we're going to do that, we've really got to bridge the gap between what we've done in the past to really reimagine what information we can collect, and then again, forge the partnerships, launch the initiatives that really make a difference in the community. Because our model has, really been, it's several decades old, I don't think we ask enough questions. And so because of that, we're not collecting the data that we would need to really reimagine how we can be of impact in the community. And until we craft a strategy around that, then, we're still going to be pushing the rock uphill. And as long as that's the approach to food insecurity, one, we won't solve it, but we're not going to be significantly or appropriately contributing to the cause. And that's what we have to change in our organization. So Trina, maybe you talk a little bit about your area and how you look at data.
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned before, it's a little bit different on my side. Essentially, we are creating research demonstration projects to look at how we can address nutritional security differently. And so we are building out new projects with the end in mind. And so we're very much looking at them from the start, from a data perspective. And we've invested a lot of resources as an organization into those programs. So Dan and his team at SPI are our data partners on those projects, because we do not have that internal data maestro that I was talking about before. We do not have that internal expertise to help us figure out what data to collect and what that looks like. And I will say, as I was going through the AISP toolkit, a few things really stood out to me. And I think it was new for us to start a program by bringing people around the table, setting that table, and asking the potential program participants to weigh in on the data we were collecting. We just got into that a little bit during this last breakout group. And that was a really unfamiliar, uncomfortable place, I think, for some of us who maybe when we went to school 20 plus years ago, were taught that we are the experts in choosing the metrics that we're going to be looking at. And so it was a very different experience to hear from community members how they were interpreting what we were asking them, what they really thought we should be asking them, and using that to kind of guide program development. And I will say that process of involving community members in determining our data strategy as well as program implementation was something really new in my career. And I think it's kind of transformed how I will think about building programs from now on. Because I think we ended up, hubris. I have my initial concept paper from 5 years ago of what I thought we needed. And I sometimes revisit it and laugh at myself. Now that we've gone through this very robust process with the community, and I just know, because we went through this process, that we are in a much stronger place with these programs. Because I would say, Bridget, we are I was listening to you as you were talking, we're in that like actively engaging, collaborating space. Like we haven't made it all the way to the end yet, right? Like there's still a lot of discomfort there for me in like completely handing over the reins. And I know that's like work for me to do, and that's work for our funders to do, and what we're being asked to create. But we have made a huge shift, and I'm seeing what that means in terms of impact on the actual program participants. And that's revolutionary to me. And so all of the activities, I think Carlton and I were both like looking at these and how do we now apply these to some of our legacy programming? So something like food banking or food pantries, how do we go back in a system that is really rooted in this like charitable food system that never got input from anyone that's impacted? How do we now go back to the community and look at what is actually needed? And how do we go about bringing those resources to the community in a way that speaks to what the community wants and needs? And that's such a transformational shift. I will say it can be a little bit intimidating to figure out how to go about doing that. There's a lot of hearts and minds that need to shift. And you talked about that, Bridget, kind of like your internal process that you've had. We've had something, we're going through that internally as well. And so, Carlton, I know you really answered some of those questions that Bridget posed during the breakout. And I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that before, Ginger, I talk to you about the data maturity assessment results. I've got so much stuff.
Yeah, well, I think it's good context. I'll try to go quickly. So one question that Jen Rose asked us as we were prepping was, what's your organization doing about building trust in your client population? So I would say we do that minimally on the food banking side. And what I mean by that is we're at arm's length, really, from the neighbor, because again, we provide food to pantries that are really having that face-to-face interaction on a regular basis. What we try to do to bridge the gap there is we've got, and I think Bridget, you talked about this as well, we've got advisory boards and other ways that we can kind of reach out and get that direct feedback. And certainly some of the events that we support and sponsor are directly with our neighbors, coming in and getting food. But those are kind of low agency events. You think about, food distribution, you drive up, you get a box, you didn't shop, you didn't, you aren't interfacing, with what exactly that you want. I mean, it's not this isn't stuff that you need, but it's not the same experience that we're trying to drive toward. So, there's kind of a minimal stake there. On the food is medicine side in Trina's shop, again, it's much more of a participatory research framework. Working with a group of folks that, have met certain criteria and develop a relationship with them over time. And that relationship is enhanced because you're bringing food to them. And that creates a bond, as we all know. Whether you needed the food or not, food creates a bond between people that sharing it together. So that creates a whole other context for us to understand the community. But is it enough? We have to continually challenge ourselves to understand it. Is that enough? Are we creating a true and equitable and accessible community data initiatives? Not yet. I mean, one of the outreaches that we've done now is that, even as a former commercial supply chain guy, one of the things that we want to do in supply chains is make them shorter and more efficient. One of the ways to do that is through local produce, right? So let's get out of some of this processed food. Let's deal with community farming, urban farming. We've done outreach in that respect, but did we do a lot of data collecting to really understand that piece? And we just launched this in the last, well, I've only been here a year, so in the last year. So there's a lot more work that we can do to understand how we can be impactful in that space and get the voice of the community. We did more, I think, than we've done in the past, but it's not going to be enough until we're really rooted in what are the things that make a real difference in people's lives and how can we impact that. We still have time, Generals? Are we okay?
I think.
Yeah, I messaged Trina. We do need to move to the Q&A soon, but I do want to have a couple of minutes to just quickly hit the points about the data maturity assessment because I got to hear them.
Yeah, so I will proudly show you guys, we got a 3.7 out of 10. And as a recovering perfectionist, I think that is something I would have previously hid from you, right? In my mind, I was like, oh, that's a failing grade. But I have to say, Ginger, number one, the first thing that spoke to me as soon as I opened the maturity assessment was this quote that you had of too often the desire to harness the power of data outpaces organizational capacity. That spoke to me. I was like, yes, that is exactly where I'm starting this assessment from. But the simplicity of how this was organized into purpose, practice, and people and giving me my results, it was so easy to use. And I do not consider myself a data analytics person, right? I use data to inform the work I do, but I don't really think of myself as a data person. But you frame the results in such an encouraging manner. And so I got this 3.7, I was like, yikes. And it's like, you've begun your data journey. You're ready to lay a strong foundation so you can continue to learn and evolve. And I was like, yes, that is such a nice way to frame this work up. I really appreciated it. And this is, I feel a little bit like I'm reviewing it for folks, but I appreciated all the information buttons because there were terms that were a little intimidating to me throughout it. I took all of my statistics classes long ago, but having just reminders of descriptive versus diagnostic versus predictive versus prescriptive analytics and being able to then be like, okay, that is the definition. And here are, now I can think of some ways that I use those in my data. How we use those, and that was really helpful.
My Zoom.
And then I feel like this will help us move to a place where we're moving from being a little bit more reactive with our data to proactive with our data and building this foundation. And so, I think this is a great place, as we've both alluded to, where we can move some ways from measuring outputs to measuring impact. And so many questions arose for me as I was looking at our results. Number one, I feel like as kind of someone at the top layer of this organization, I should not say that I was not sure on so many answers, but there was just so many times that I'm not really sure how we're collecting data across the organization as a whole. That made me realize how many bigger conversations we need to be having because there are 4 of us who maintain the main data systems across the organization. I was really interested in this concept of doing it doing the assessment at multiple times over time. So taking it now and then being able to go back in 6 months after we've spent some time on it and dig back into, okay, where have we like moved ourselves forward in some of these areas? Where do we still need to concentrate our time and efforts? And I was also wondering how this could be used. We have such variability across our departments. So, if we do have some departments that are a little bit more data savvy or kind of already in that place where we'd like to see others come along to. And does it make sense to do this, by department, or is it really meant to be an organizational perspective? And how do you parse out those differences when you're doing this assessment? And so those were some of the questions. I also just to wrap it up so we can get to Q&A, I found the resource library really helpful because after I looked at this, it was like, okay, so where do I go next? Like, I kind of wanted a red button, right? Like press here to start your data journey. And so, I went to the resource library. I loved that they were organized by like beginner versus intermediate. And I immediately, of course, went to the ones that said things like 10 steps to creating a data-driven culture. Like, okay, give me the steps that I need to start making these changes. And so overall, I found it was a really helpful place, and it left me with a really helpful tool for us to use and to start a conversation within our organization. And the question, I guess, it left me like with our, do we work on one area at a time? Is it purpose then practice then people? Are we working concurrently in those areas? I think I already know the answer to this, but like, is there a right way to approach this data journey? And then ultimately, if we don't have the data expertise in-house, where do we look for that expert technical assistance if we do have the resources to help bring more minds and bodies to that table? And I will stop there, Jen Rose.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so very, very much, Trina, Carlton, and other colleagues at Operation Food Search who are with us today as well. I see Kate and Katie and Perry. So thank you to Operation Food Search for sharing your work, your grappling, and giving a peek into your experience with the data maturity assessment. And you closed, Trina, with some really phenomenal questions as well. And so as we're kind of thinking about just the time that we have remaining with our event today, we wanted to use that as a springboard just to do a little bit of quick housekeeping and then come right back to this discussion. So as folks, I'm sure, have 3 o'clock things on their calendars that we just don't want to bump up against too closely, we'd be remiss not to mention and do a humble plug. Speaking of data, we really value feedback from our community in terms of helping to inform the offerings that we're putting together. So please let us know how we can work toward this goal of building capacity and connection around equitable data practices through a very, very brief post-event survey. If you have a couple of minutes, even in the background while we're wrapping up and having discussions, that would be so valued and appreciated. Thank you so very much. Also, thrilled to debut and announce, I think this is hot off the presses, our next learning event, data-informed, equity-driven, cultivating a collaborative data culture in early May, featuring an amazing next set of panelists and presenters offering diverse perspectives around equity, community, and how do we really together cultivate collaboration around data and culture. So Sana Dawes, Shrita Love, and Ram Mashariki, who many here may already know and be familiar with as a group and individuals. And so really excited to bring those folks together. Cheers and thanks to Jen Rose for dropping those links in the chat so folks have them handy and available. So we always like to leave with 3 things you can do as we springboard into discussion. Bring this conversation back to your organization, especially where we left off with some of the great questions that Trina and Carlton were helping to demonstrate and show and offer into the space. Share those thoughts and ideas with us. Again, the survey, you can also email us at any time. Jen Rose has very kindly made herself available to organizations to hear their stories, to think about these learning events, and to help to make these as useful and beneficial to folks as we can. And then, of course, a humble, shameless plug to join us along with the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance. Membership is completely free. It's a terrific local St. Louis organization and network around building shared and collaborative data culture and infrastructure and learning. So with that, we'll move things over to a discussion, invite Ginger, Bridget, Carlton, Trina back into the space. And then, of course, open up the floor if any of our participants would like to come off mute or put in the chat any questions or things that are brewing in their minds. And thanks again to all for being here with us today.
I can start really quickly and I just want to, the way in which Trina and Carlton kind of acknowledge their own humility in terms of tackling, like, I really do think like using data is a way of working. It's not on the side. It's how we will work, how we will think critically to ultimately achieve the outcome. And if we really use data at every step of the life cycle to be able to do that, right? So Carlton, to your point, this is about, you know, reducing hunger. We don't want people in our community to be hungry anymore. It's not that we want to make sure we can distribute food, right? That is a means to an end. And so how we use data across that life cycle, that's where the power is. And it will ask us to change how we work. And so we do have to like come to it and say, hey, there have been things that we've done that may be misguided, but we actually, I had the great luxury of interviewing Amy Sample Ward and Afua Bruce, who just wrote a book called The Tech That Comes Next. And Amy so eloquently said, well, we are actually the change we've been looking for. And I think that that's true. And, you know, all of us need to carry this water a little bit and make this progress over time. So I just thank you to Carlton and Trina for doing the work.
Well, thank you, Ginger and Bridget. I will have to say I was kind of listening to you guys talk in the green room, and it was exciting to hear the discussion around, you know, community building and equity, and you know the real work that has to be done. And you know, Ginger, as you said, you know, data is a tool, it's a pathway, it's critically important, but it can't just come from us. You know, one of the things that probably telling stories out of school, I guess, but you know, we do have concerns that we talk to each other too much. So, you know, how should we interface differently with the community? Well, we can't decide that in this conference room. We have to go into the community and understand what that is and how can we make it a significant difference. And this, you know, I really love this framework. I think Bridget, you shared it was a community engagement framework as part of your work, which is a powerful tool. You encourage everybody to look at that as well, because it is very much centered around the successes and the strengths of community, as opposed to what I think that philanthropic organizations often say, this is what's wrong with pick a place, North Philly. So let's fix North Philly by putting more whatever that we think is not in North Philly now. We're going to put more in the North Philly. North Philly is where my father's from. So yeah, is that really fixing anything, or is it just making us feel better? And are we differentiating between the two? So thank you for that work.
And there is a question in the chat. I don't know if the participant from WePower wants to come off mute, or I can just read it. But one thing, let's see.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh yeah, I was just going to say thanks Kate at WePower here in St. Louis. And so the question being a bit of struggle in terms of how and when to include community voices and perspectives when collecting data for organizational OKRs, objectives and key results to measure internal effectiveness. So in addition to thinking about grant making and the grant process, you know, kind of thinking about data kind of more foundationally at the organizational level.
I really want to hear what Bridget has to say about this, but I would love to start by thinking about who you hire. I think, you know, the more folks that we can get from the neighborhoods and communities that we seek to empower and seek to support, the more inclusive our strategy can be. And And then again, I think that there's a great opportunity around ongoing workforce development, workforce training within our not-for-profit organization. So I would encourage you to be brazen with your philanthropic partners. That if we want to have conversations about inclusivity and equity and empowerment, then we need to make sure that it's resourced. And the data science skills required need to be cultivated on an ongoing basis. And I think entities like the work that you're doing, Dan and Jen Rose, need to be continually supported, and the work that Paul's doing, but we need to create spaces and places where people can continue to build the skill set at the speed that's required to drive this change, and also to embed their own experiences in how we're analyzing information, developing insight, and enhancing strategy.
Bridget, you got a plug both from Ginger and then a follow-up question from Kate, or a follow-up question from Kate. Yeah, if you wanted to jump in here, that'd be great.
Sure thing. Related to the first question, Kate, around including community perspectives and organizational objectives, key results. I think literally, if you're just talking about your team, your internal team, to your department, and you're saying, oh, how quick are we at responding to requests? Then maybe you might not need, actual community input. But defining who community could be, I think it's important to determining who should be a part of the conversation. Because if your internal staff, like my staff members who are program content, are also my stakeholders. And so it's important that I am including their feedback into organizational objectives and key results as well, to determine effectiveness, if we're not talking specifically around programs. So I think that's how I would answer that question. And then, sorry. Kate's question about collecting data could make a great, oh wait, hearing more perspectives beyond grant making. And I guess I would wonder, are we talking actually programmatic? Are we talking about community participatory research? Because ultimately we do both. We include, depending on who it is. I think I saw a question earlier too about young people. Our young people are 14 to 24. So when I talk about youth and young adults, they're 14 to 24. We do support some summer programming, but our target population is young people between 14 and 24. And so I say young people all the time. And so including young people as part of the researchers. So our co-managers, our youth who are co-managers on our youth and grant making experience, they are leading the evaluation strategy with the evaluation consultant as well, designing research questions, understanding why are we looking, what do we want to understand our impact is from this work. So they are a part of it from start to finish as well.
Thanks so much for those. And yes, Kate acknowledging in the chat as well. Good point to define community, and getting back to some of the original kind of framing of the question as well, is including community voices and perspectives when collecting data for organizations' objectives and key results, and then incorporating community into even forming and leading your organization's objectives and key results, being something to grow to and to work towards as well. So really fantastic conversation happening in the chat. Matthew uplifting the question. Thanks, Matthew. This could make a great topic for the series for a talk or a social sector snapshot on the future. I'm looking at Jen Rose's rectangle with a couple of our upcoming learning events, particularly in mind. So thanks, Matthew, for that one, to be sure. Maya has a great point around yes to staffing, nonprofits and academia in particular, being stuck in an us doing for them space, needing to be more an us doing for us. And so thanks for the great point, Maya. Are there other questions from earlier in the event, other reflections from Ginger, Bridget, Trina, Carlton that you wanted to offer into the space?
Bridget, I'm really interested in that space where we're bringing community participants or community members to the table. We have started implementing things like stipends for people's time. If I'm paid to be at a table by my employer, you should be paid to be at the table as well. I I think the part where I get stuck a little bit in the work is the power dynamic when you're bringing community members to the table with people who are in positions of power and are used to wielding that power. How do you create, what resources out there to help create an environment that gives equal power to the participants or the community members that you're bringing to that table of stakeholders?
No, I think that's a great question, and one that we wrestle with a lot, that we don't want to create or exacerbate further harm by bringing community members into the conversation. And so what we attempted to do, or what we're attempting to do is with our collaboratives, is actually we're doing race equity and equity trainings with with our funder, sorry, philanthropy is with our context. So we're doing that with both our practitioners as well as the funder community. And so ultimately it's them coming to a space where like people have conversations like, hey, we want to make sure that we are in a good space to be able to support youth and young adults. We're lucky that really a lot of the people that we're working with love to hear from the young people. And so they are really, when the young people are not in the room now, they're like, oh, wait, what's going on? And so how can we get young people perspectives in the conversation? And so it's having to help them, support them and showing up. We do prepare our young people. I'll say that's another thing. So sometimes you will just sit young people or community members in meetings without context. And so we actually have meetings prior to the meetings with our community with our community members, young people, whoever they may be. We talk about the agenda. We answer any questions that they may have ahead of the meeting. So then when they come to the meeting, they can already kind of feel at least at the level playing field so that they can show up the way that they would like to show up.
That's really helpful to hear. And I think, moving from that space where people like to hear from community members, but ultimately do their voices have the same or more power in the final decisions that are being made, like switching from that place where it's, yes, we've heard from them, but we're still going to make this decision over here, versus really authentically engaging that community in being the ones to broker that power and make that decision.
I think the way you do that is by giving them a vote, right? In the decision-making process. So literally allowing and enabling co-ownership of community throughout the entire process, whatever process it may be. So if it's research, if it's funding, if it's programs, like ensuring that they have the ability to influence the actual outcome, I think is going to be important.
Amazing. Yeah, Carlton's already with the applause. I was looking for my emoji applause button in the background, but no, thank you so very, very much. And just with a humble eye on the clock and seeing a couple of people saying thanks so much for the great event, and there are 3 o'clock Zooms or at the top of the hour, depending on your time zone. Bridget, Ginger, Carlton, Trina, thank you again so very much for sharing your experience, your passion, for this topic area with St. Louis social sector colleagues and beyond. So again, if you missed the links in the chat, you can scroll back up in terms of registration for our next May event. We look forward to seeing many of you there as well. Please do fill out the brief post-event questionnaire, which we do use to help to plan for our future events. Again, shout out to Matthew for the great plug on a possible event feature, to be sure, or series. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone in the not too distant future. And thanks again to our amazing panelists and presenters for the really terrific insights.